The child in the rain. If there's one thing the road has taught me, it's that the night hides things you'd never imagine seeing. I've been a trucker for over a decade, and I've seen it all, but nothing prepared me for that rainy night in rural Virginia. The rain was falling hard, like a dense curtain that turned the road into a continuous blur. It was hard to see more than a few meters ahead, and the sound of the raindrops on the windshield seemed to drown out every other noise. The route was one of the most isolated ones I used to take, cutting through a rural area full of abandoned farms and small villages that seemed forgotten by time. I was a few hours from my destination when, out of nowhere, I saw something on the side of the road. I slowed down to get a better look. It was a child, completely soaked, standing there, motionless, as if waiting for someone. It didn't make any sense. Who would leave a child alone on a night like that, in the middle of nowhere? I stopped the truck and rolled down the window, shouting to her. The child didn't respond or move. I decided to get out, already feeling the cold rain soaking through my clothes. I approached her slowly, worried about scaring her. She must have been around 8 or 9 years old, dressed in simple clothes that clung to her body from the rain. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she was staring at the ground, not even lifting her head to look at me. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. She didn't answer, just kept standing there, not even shivering from the cold, which I found odd. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone, no sign of a house or car nearby. The road was deserted. I couldn't leave her there. Hesitantly, I reached out to her. "Come on, I can take you somewhere safe." Without saying a word, the child took my hand. Her skin was cold, almost as if there was no warmth in her body. I led her to the truck's cab, where she sat in the passenger seat. I closed the door and got back behind the wheel, still trying to process what was happening. She didn't say a single word the entire time she was there. I tried to make conversation, asking where her parents were, but all I got was silence in response. The only sound was the rain hitting the truck. Finally, I arrived at my destination, a small truck stop where I was to make a delivery. When I turned off the engine and turned to speak to her, the seat was empty. The child had vanished. I looked around, checked the entire cab, but she was simply gone. All that was left was a wet spot on the seat, as if she had never been there, except for the undeniable proof that something had been there. My mind started racing with possibilities. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. I decided to ask the workers at the truck stop if they knew of any child in the area. They exchanged glances, and one of the older ones told me a story that sent chills down my spine. Years ago, a girl disappeared on that same road on a rainy night. Her parents lost sight of her for a moment, and she was never seen again. Since then, some drivers have reported seeing a child on the side of the road, always on stormy nights, always disappearing without a trace. The story hit me like a punch to the gut. Had I encountered the ghost of that girl? I'm not sure what I saw that night, but since then, every time I see the rain start to fall on the road, I remember that young, silent face standing by the roadside, like a memory that will never fade. He voice on the radio. In the life of a trucker, loneliness is a constant companion. When you spend endless nights on the road, the CB radio becomes one of the few connections to the outside world. Those unknown and distant voices that pop up now and then share stories, warn about traffic, or simply keep you company during those solitary hours. But that night, what I heard was far more unsettling than any casual conversation. I was driving down a remote road in North Carolina, cutting through a vast forested area. The night was moonless, and the trees formed a dark wall on both sides of the road. I had passed a small town hours before and knew I wouldn't see another until dawn. The clock showed just after midnight when the CB radio began to crackle. This isn't uncommon, especially in such isolated areas. I adjusted the volume, hoping the static would disappear, but instead, the static was replaced by a voice. It was a female voice, sounding faint and distant, but clearly desperate. "Please, can someone help me? I'm lost. I'm in the woods. Please." The cry for help caught me off guard. I responded on the radio, asking who it was and where exactly she was, but all I heard was more static. I kept calling, trying to get more information, but the voice didn't reply. The only sound that repeated was the initial plea for help, increasingly distorted. That voice left me uneasy. I thought about turning off the radio and continuing on my way, but something told me I needed to investigate. After a few minutes, the road forked, with a small dirt road leading into the forest. I decided to follow it, a decision that, looking back, I wonder if I would make again. I drove down that narrow trail for about 20 minutes, trying to locate the signal's origin. There were no lights, no houses, or signs of life, just the sound of leaves and branches crunching under the truck's tires. Just as I was about to give up, I saw something among the trees, a small cabin, almost hidden in the darkness. My heart was pounding as I got out of the truck. I grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the cabin. The door was ajar, and the old wood creaked under my feet. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but in the middle of the room, on a dusty table, was a CB radio, still on. The voice kept coming from that old device, repeating the same cry for help, but now it sounded almost like a whisper. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The cabin was empty, with no signs that anyone had been there. A chill ran down my spine. There was nothing more I could do there. I returned to the truck, not looking back, and drove back to the main road as fast as I could. That night, there were no more radio disturbances. The voice vanished just as it had appeared, leaving only a lingering sense of strangeness and fear. When I mentioned what had happened to other truckers days later, some laughed, while others just shook their heads, as if they knew something I didn't. A few mentioned local legends about people who disappeared in those woods, whose voices might still be heard on the darkest nights. Since that night, I've avoided that route. I don't know what that voice was or if I fell victim to some kind of illusion. But what I do know is that I'll never forget the desperation in those words, echoing in the solitude of the road. The truck stop robbery. I've been a truck driver for almost 20 years, and in all that time, I've faced plenty of tough situations on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night at a truck stop in rural Texas. It was a night like any other, and I was heading home after a long delivery. The road was quiet, with little traffic, which is normal for that area. I decided to stop at a truck stop I was familiar with, a secluded spot that had always seemed safe. I was tired and needed to rest before continuing my journey. I parked my truck in a distant corner, as I usually do, to avoid the noise of other vehicles that might arrive during the night. I locked the doors, adjusted the seat to get comfortable, and quickly fell asleep. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I was abruptly awakened by loud banging on the passenger door. My heart raced, and in the midst of the shock, I spent a few seconds trying to grasp what was happening. I looked in the side mirror and saw the silhouettes of several men around my truck. The dim light from the nearest streetlight only partially illuminated their faces, but enough for me to realize they were armed. This was the kind of situation you hear about, but never expect to happen to you. I was alone, with no one nearby to call for help. Instinctively, my first thought was to start the engine and try to get out of there as fast as possible, but a feeling of paralysis gripped me for a moment. They kept banging on the door, harder each time, and I knew I didn't have much time before they managed to break into the cab. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and without hesitation, floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, and I saw in the mirror that the men started running towards a car parked further back, trying to chase me. The engine roared as I sped down the deserted road, my sweaty hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The headlights of the car behind me lit up the inside of the cab, and I knew that if I slowed down, they would catch me. I kept accelerating until finally, the headlights began to fade, eventually disappearing completely. Only when the silence returned to the truck did I allow myself to breathe a sigh of relief. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking. I knew I had narrowly escaped. The next day, when I reached my destination, I heard from other truckers that several of them had been robbed at that same stop in recent weeks. Some weren't as lucky as I was and ended up seriously injured. That incident left a deep mark on me. Now, whenever I stop to rest, I make sure to choose busier places where there are more people around. That night taught me that the road can be a dangerous place, and no matter how prepared you are, the unexpected can happen at any moment. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. Chased on the road. I've been a truck driver for many years, and I've always enjoyed the calmness of the roads at night. The roads are emptier, and the silence helps me focus on the journey. But after what happened that night, I started seeing things differently. I was on a night trip crossing the state of Nevada, a long, almost deserted road. The only company I had was the stars in the sky and the constant sound of tires on the asphalt. Everything seemed calm until I noticed something that began to make me uneasy. It was around 2 in the morning when I realized a car had appeared in my rearview mirror. It kept a fixed distance, always in the same spot, never trying to pass me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was another night driver just following the flow. But as the minutes passed, I started feeling that something was off. The car stayed at exactly the same distance, matching every turn and acceleration I made. I was getting nervous. I tried slowing down, hoping the car would pass me, but it only slowed down too, keeping behind me like a shadow. This was starting to really irritate and worry me. I turned on the CB radio to see if any colleagues were nearby, but the silence was complete. The car, however, was still there, its headlights like eyes fixed on me. I decided to speed up, trying to leave it behind. Flooring the gas pedal, the truck's engine roared loudly, and for a moment, I thought I would lose the car. But to my surprise, the car sped up too. That's when panic started to set in. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, feeling sweat trickle down my forehead. I knew I needed to think fast. The road was becoming more winding, and the car wasn't giving up the chase. On one of those curves, I noticed a small side road, unlit and almost hidden among the trees. I decided to take a chance. I made a sharp turn and took the side road, immediately turning off the headlights and continuing for a few meters in complete darkness. I stopped the truck and held my breath, listening only to the sound of the engine calming down. I waited in silence, imagining what would happen next. The minutes felt like hours, but the car never showed up. I was alone on that dark, isolated road, and a feeling of relief started to take over. Slowly, I turned the headlights back on and made a U-turn, heading back to the main road. There was no sign of the car. I continued my journey, more alert than ever. The next morning, when I reached my destination, I shared what had happened with some fellow drivers. That's when they told me that the area was known for cargo thefts. Other truckers had reported similar chases, but some weren't as lucky as I was to escape. The suspicion was that these chases were carried out by specialized thieves, waiting for the right moment to strike. Since that night, I never again take the quietness of the road for granted. I've learned to always stay alert because danger can be lurking, even when everything seems calm. The broken down truck. Anyone who drives lonely roads, especially at night, knows that the unexpected can happen at any moment. I learned this the hard way one night that should have been just another in my long trucking career. I was driving down a deserted road in New Mexico, one of those routes that seem endless, where civilization is just a distant memory. The sky was clear, but the cold wind indicated that a storm might be approaching. Everything was going fine until, without any warning, the truck's engine began to fail. The truck gave a few jolts and then stopped completely. I tried starting the engine again, but there was no response. I got out to check what might be happening. The road was completely empty, and the silence around me was almost oppressive. I opened the hood and started examining the engine, but I didn't find anything immediately that explained the problem. Maybe it was something electrical, something I couldn't fix there, in the middle of nowhere. As I was tinkering with the engine, I heard the sound of a motorcycle approaching. I looked up and saw, on the horizon, two headlights coming closer. Part of me felt relieved not to be alone on that deserted road anymore, but another part, maybe instinctively, felt a growing discomfort. The two men on the motorcycle stopped beside the truck. They seemed friendly at first glance, asking if I needed help. But there was something in their demeanor, something that made me keep my guard up. The way they looked at the truck, as if they were evaluating more than just the engine problem, made me uneasy. I thanked them for the offer of help but said that I had already called for assistance and that they were on their way. This made them exchange a quick look, and the discomfort I felt intensified. One of the men, with a forced smile, said they could wait with me until the supposed assistance arrived. At that moment, I knew something was wrong. They weren't there to help, they were there for something much worse. With my heart racing, I turned slowly back to the hood, as if I were just adjusting something, and then said, with the firmest voice I could muster, "Actually, the police radioed me too. They said they patrol this area and would stop by to check on things." It was as if a switch had been flipped. The two men exchanged glances, the smile on the closer one's face vanished, and without saying another word, they quickly got back on the motorcycle and sped off, disappearing into the darkness of the road. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. They had bad intentions, I was sure of it. And my lie was probably what saved me from something much worse. With my hands still shaking, I got back in the truck. I tried starting the engine again, and this time it started as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to find out more. I got into the cab, started the engine, and drove down the road as fast as I could until I found a safer stop. When I reached my destination the next day, I told the story to some fellow truckers. They told me it wasn't uncommon in those deserted areas for there to be attempted robberies, where the thieves posed as good Samaritans. But that feeling, of being at the mercy of the unknown, still haunts me. Since then, I've always carried with me a constant wariness, a reminder that on the road, danger can appear disguised as kindness. And that sometimes, you have to trust your instincts to survive. The quick abduction. Truckers are used to unexpected situations, but there are events that no one is prepared to face. What happened to me on that busy road in California was one of those events, something that left scars not only on my mind but on my soul. I was on a stretch of the I-5, one of the state's busiest highways. The trip had been smooth so far, traffic was flowing normally, and I could already see the sign for the next gas station where I planned to stop for a quick bite. It was around 8 at night, the sun had already set, and the vehicle lights created an endless trail of brightness on the highway. Suddenly, a small car swerved in front of me, cutting me off abruptly. I had no choice but to slam on the brakes, forcing the truck to stop suddenly. Before I could understand what was happening, 3 men jumped out of the car and ran toward my cab. They were armed, their faces partially covered by masks. My heart raced, and my instincts told me to start the truck again and try to escape, but what happened next was so quick I didn't have time to react. One of the men broke the passenger side window and pointed a gun at me, shouting for me to get out. I was pulled out of the truck and thrown into the back seat of their car, with a hood placed over my head. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. As the car sped away, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The only thing I could hear was the sound of the engine and the heavy breathing of my captors. I had no idea where they were taking me or what they planned to do with me. Every minute felt like an eternity. After some time, which felt like hours to me, the car stopped. I was dragged out of the vehicle and taken to what seemed like a cabin or some kind of abandoned building. They threw me onto the cold, damp floor, tied my hands and feet, and left me there in the dark. The only thing I could think about was that I might never leave that place alive. I heard them messing with the truck. They were unloading the cargo. That was probably what they wanted from the start, but the fear that they wouldn't let me leave alive wouldn't leave me alone. After what felt like forever, the silence returned. They had finished what they came to do. One of the men approached me, mumbled something to the others, and then I was left there, alone. I heard the car drive away and disappear into the distance. I stayed still for a while, trying to process what had happened and what I should do next. With great effort, I managed to free myself from the ties and remove the hood. I was in a forest, near a secondary road, surrounded by darkness and cold. But I was alive. I started walking, not really knowing where to go, until after some time, I found a small road, and, luckily, a car passed by and stopped to help me. They took me to the nearest town, where I was finally able to call the police. The men were never found, and the cargo was never recovered. Since that night, the trauma of the abduction stays with me. The road, which was once a place of freedom, now has a dark side that I can't forget. And every time I pass through an isolated stretch, I feel that fear return, a constant reminder that no matter how well we know the dangers of the road, we are never fully prepared for them. The trap on the highway. There's a feeling of vulnerability that comes over you when you're alone on a dark, deserted road. As a truck driver, I'm used to these situations, but that night, something told me that the solitude of the road was hiding more than just silence. I was traveling down a highway in the Midwest, a stretch that cuts through miles of plains with no sign of civilization nearby. The only company I had was the sound of the engine and the dim headlights barely illuminating the road ahead. The clock showed it was almost midnight when I noticed something unusual up ahead. Traffic cones were set up on the road, forcing vehicles to slow down and merge into a narrower lane. I knew there were no scheduled construction works on that stretch, and this immediately put me on alert. Despite the growing unease, I slowed down, trying to figure out what was going on. As I got closer to the cones, they seemed to move. Suddenly, masked figures emerged from the shadows on the side of the road. There were 4 or 5 men, all dressed in black with their faces covered, moving towards my truck. They were holding metal bars and other objects that looked like improvised weapons. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to act fast. There was no time to think, it was a matter of survival. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, making the truck lurch forward. The cones were tossed aside as the men tried to reach me. Some of them hit the sides of the truck, trying to force their way in, but I didn't stop. The engine roared as I sped down the narrow road, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I could see the silhouettes of the men growing smaller until they disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, but I knew I couldn't slow down. Not until I was sure I was safe. I kept driving for several miles, not daring to stop or look back for too long. Finally, I spotted the lights of a gas station. I pulled in, still breathless and on high alert. The attendant, seeing the look on my face, asked if I was okay. I told him what had happened, and he just shook his head with a concerned expression. He told me that area was becoming notorious for attacks on truckers, a new tactic used by gangs who set up fake roadworks to force drivers to stop. Few had managed to escape unharmed, and some truckers hadn't been as lucky as I was. After that experience, I became even more cautious on my nighttime trips. The road, which was already a place of challenges, now seemed to hide even greater dangers. The sense of safety was never the same again. Every stop, every isolated stretch, now carries the weight of that fear that follows me on every trip. Marks on the road. I was driving on a deserted road in the interior of Mato Grosso, a place where civilization seemed to have drifted away long ago. The journey up to that point had been peaceful, the sky was clear, and the day was sunny. But as the sun began to set, the landscape around me transformed into something entirely different. Night fell suddenly, like a curtain of darkness that enveloped everything around me. The road, which had earlier seemed like just any other path, now felt like an endless tunnel, surrounded by thick, unsettling shadows. There wasn't a single soul in sight, no lights, no other vehicles. It was just me and the oppressive silence. The radio, which had been playing music to ease the loneliness, suddenly stopped picking up any signal, leaving only static noise. I tried tuning into another station, but it was useless. The isolation of the road now felt complete, and a chill ran down my spine. It was at that moment that the truck's lights began to flicker. They flashed, wavering as if they were about to go out completely. The engine, which had been running perfectly, began to sputter, making small popping sounds that echoed in the night. My stomach churned at the thought of being stranded in that place. I slowed down, hoping the truck would stabilize, but the engine died completely before I could react. The last light went out, and the silence was replaced by absolute darkness. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. I got out of the truck, using a small flashlight I kept in the glove box to illuminate the engine. The wind made the leaves of the trees rustle around me, creating a sound that almost seemed like a distant, almost human, murmur. As I examined the engine, trying to figure out what was wrong, I heard footsteps coming from the woods next to the road. My senses went into high alert. They were light footsteps, but distinct, as if someone, or something, was moving between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something like that. But the footsteps were rhythmic, almost as if they were following a pattern, like someone trying to approach unnoticed. I stood still, holding the flashlight with a trembling hand, my mind struggling to rationalize what was happening. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds before they stopped abruptly, leaving the silence even more oppressive. I knew I needed to get out of there, and fast. I closed the truck's hood and, trying to ignore the growing fear, got back into the cab. When I opened the door and got in, something immediately caught my attention. On the truck door, where I had leaned to get out, there were handprints. They were dirty marks, as if someone with hands covered in dirt or mud had pressed against the metal. The problem was, those marks hadn't been there before. My heart raced. Who, or what, had touched the truck while I was outside? I looked around, trying to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, making it impossible to see beyond the limited beam of the flashlight. Without thinking twice, I turned the key in the ignition. To my relief, the engine roared back to life, the lights came back on, and the feeling of panic began to subside. I floored the gas pedal and got out of there as fast as I could, without looking back. I drove for miles until I finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. When I finally stopped, still trembling, I got out of the truck to check the marks again. They had vanished, as if they had never been there. To this day, I don't know what left those marks or who was watching me on that deserted road. And maybe it's better that way. But every time I pass through an isolated place, I remember that night and feel the same chill down my spine. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes, loneliness isn't the worst thing you can encounter. The blizzard in the mountains. Driving through mountainous roads is a challenge at any time of year, but winter in Colorado's Rocky Mountains can turn a simple trip into a true test of survival. I always knew the risks, but that night, the mountains taught me the real meaning of facing the unknown. It was the end of a long workday, and I was on my way home, hauling an important load to a small town on the other side of the mountains. The sky was clear when I started the climb, but as I went further, the weather began to change. The clouds closed in quickly, and the icy wind blowing across the mountainsides brought with it a bad feeling. I started to see the first snowflakes falling slowly, dancing in the air around the truck. I thought it was just a sign that winter was coming, nothing to worry about. But within minutes, the snow intensified, covering the road with a white, slippery blanket. Visibility dropped drastically, and soon, I was driving in a tunnel of darkness and snow, not knowing exactly where the road ended and the cliff began. The tension started to build inside me. The road was treacherous, with sharp curves and dangerous inclines that demanded full attention. Now, with the snow and ice piling up, every mile felt like an almost insurmountable challenge. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, but the snow was falling so heavily that even with the headlights on full, I could barely see a few meters ahead. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. I was completely alone on that mountain, the radio picking up no signal, and the only sound was the wind howling around the truck and the tires struggling to grip the ice-covered asphalt. Every now and then, the truck would skid, and I'd feel my heart stop for a second as I tried to keep control and avoid sliding off the edge of the road. The mountain seemed to stretch on forever, each curve blending into the next, and the blizzard kept intensifying. The snow didn't stop falling, covering everything with a thick layer that hid the dangers the mountainous road held. The sense of danger was constant, and every minute felt like an eternity. It was on one of those treacherous curves that I felt the truck begin to slide toward the edge of the road. The ice under the tires gave way, and the truck tilted dangerously to the side. For a moment that seemed to last forever, I thought it was the end. I saw the edge of the cliff getting closer, and panic took over. But with a quick reflex, I turned the wheel in the opposite direction and managed, miraculously, to stabilize the truck. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but I knew I wasn't out of danger yet. It was then that I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that chilled me to the bone. A vehicle behind me, trying to follow closely, completely lost control. I saw the car's headlights swing wildly from side to side as the driver struggled to maintain control, but it was in vain. In one terrifying second, the car veered off the road and plunged down the embankment. The headlights disappeared into the darkness below, and soon after, silence fell. The horror of that scene left me paralyzed for a moment. The fear that something similar could happen to me was overwhelming. I knew I couldn't stop to help because that would mean risking my own life in those extreme conditions. So, with a heavy heart and a mind in shock, I kept driving, more tense than ever, knowing that every curve could be the last. The road seemed endless, and the exhaustion began to weigh on me, but I knew stopping wasn't an option. The thought of what I had just witnessed pushed me to keep going, but the fear that the ice might betray me again was constant. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of a small gas station, a lone point of light in the white vastness. I managed to maneuver the truck into the rest area and stopped, my heart still racing. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment in silence, letting the relief finally wash over me. The truck was safe, and I was out of danger, but the images of that night wouldn't leave my mind. I went to the attendant, who looked at me with a look of astonishment when he saw my state. I briefly told him what had happened, and he told me it wasn't the first time someone had gone through something like that on that mountain. He offered me a hot coffee, and I accepted, still trying to process what I had just lived through. That blizzard taught me a valuable lesson about respecting nature and the dangers of the road. No matter how much experience you have, the road and the mountain always have the final say. I never want to go through something like that again, and every time I think of that night, I feel the same chill down my spine, reminding me that on the road, safety is never guaranteed. The accident on the road. The road is unpredictable. Each trip can be smooth or turn into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. As a truck driver, you learn to deal with these uncertainties, but nothing prepares you for when the worst really happens. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that makes you forget about the dangers of the road. The sky was clear, no clouds, and the sun was shining brightly, creating that typical mirage on the asphalt. I was driving on a busy highway in rural Georgia, hauling a routine load, not in any hurry, just enjoying the good weather. Traffic was flowing smoothly, with no complications, and I felt confident. Everything pointed to a calm journey. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw a small car approaching rapidly in the rearview mirror. It wasn't unusual to see drivers in a rush trying to weave between larger vehicles, but something about that car made me stay on high alert. It was zigzagging between lanes, speeding recklessly, as if trying to save precious seconds in an imaginary race. I maintained my speed, keeping an eye on the driver's behavior. As the car got closer, I saw that it was trying to overtake me on the right, a dangerous move, especially on a busy highway like that one. Before I could react, the car accelerated sharply, trying to cut in front of me. I felt my stomach turn as I watched the scene unfold in slow motion before my eyes. I tried to brake, but the truck's weight and speed made the maneuver nearly impossible. The small car was struck by the front of my truck, and in a second, it was thrown off the road. The sound of the impact was deafening, a noise that still echoes in my mind to this day. The car rolled over several times before coming to a stop, crushed and unrecognizable, on the side of the highway. My heart raced, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by shock. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. When I finally managed to react, I pulled the truck over to the shoulder and ran towards the car. Each step felt like an eternity, as if my feet were stuck in quicksand. I reached the car and saw the devastation up close. The metal was twisted, the glass shattered everywhere. The interior was destroyed, and the silence that followed the accident was deafening. I wanted to help, but I knew, deep down, that there was nothing more that could be done. The scene was desperate, a sight I would never forget. Other drivers began to stop, some called emergency services while I tried, in vain, to do something for the occupants of the car. The sirens of the ambulance and fire trucks didn't take long to arrive, but time seemed to drag on. When they finally arrived, I was pulled away from the scene. The paramedics and firefighters worked quickly, but the look on their faces said it all. There were no survivors. I stood there, in shock, as the rescue team did what they could. The police arrived soon after, and I was taken to give a statement. I told them what had happened, but the words felt empty, as if they weren't enough to express the reality of what had just occurred. Everything happened so fast, a sequence of seconds that changed everything. After hours of questions and formalities, I was released. But the weight of that accident stayed with me. The images of the car being thrown off the road, of the impact, of the devastation, kept coming back to me whenever I closed my eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scenes replayed endlessly, reminding me of how everything can change in the blink of an eye. The days that followed were difficult. I tried to get back into my routine, continue my work, but the memory of that day was always there, hanging over me like a dark cloud. The feeling of helplessness, of not having been able to prevent the accident, was overwhelming. I found myself replaying every moment, thinking about what I could have done differently, but I knew that the reality was unchangeable. The road, which used to be a place where I felt comfortable and safe, now seemed like a hostile territory, full of hidden dangers. Every time I see a small car approaching in the rearview mirror, my heart races, the fear returning like a shadow that never dissipates. The images of that accident still haunt me to this day, especially at night, when I'm alone on the road, surrounded only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the weight of the memories I carry. The forced stop transporting cargo through remote areas always has its risks, but on that trip, I was about to face a danger I could never have imagined. The route was taking me through a tense area in the interior of Para, where there were conflicts between landowners and land invaders. I knew tensions were high in that region, but with my cargo properly authorized and all the paperwork in order, I didn't expect any problems. However, the road has a way of surprising us. I was driving down a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense vegetation that stretched for miles with no sign of life. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and casting long shadows over the road. The silence of the surrounding forest was unsettling, and the feeling of isolation made me stay extra vigilant. Everything was calm until, suddenly, I saw something ahead that made my stomach turn. Blocking the road was a group of armed men, their faces covered with bandanas, leaving only their eyes visible. They had placed tree trunks and large rocks in the middle of the road, forming an improvised barricade. My heart raced as I approached, knowing I had no choice but to stop. I was trapped. I slowed down and stopped the truck a few meters from the blockade. My thoughts raced, trying to find a solution, but before I could think of anything, one of the men approached the cab and pounded on the driver's door. The sound echoed in the silence like thunder announcing the start of a storm. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and opened the door. "Get out of the truck, now." The man's voice was authoritative, and he held a rifle, which only increased my apprehension. I slowly got out, keeping my hands visible. The other men approached, surrounding the truck. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, stared at me with cold, distrustful eyes. He demanded to know what I was transporting, and I showed him the documents, trying to explain that it was legal cargo, authorized, and that I wasn't involved in anything illegal. But he didn't seem interested in the papers I handed over. "This here is contraband," he said, with a calm that was frightening, throwing the documents to the ground. "And you're going to hand it over to us." I tried to argue, but before I could say anything, he raised his weapon and pointed it at me. My body tensed up, and I realized there was no way out. Any resistance could cost me my life. With no choice, I nodded, indicating that I would do as they asked. With trembling hands, I got back into the truck and started maneuvering to release the cargo. They ordered me to follow them to a nearby clearing, where a smaller truck, already waiting, was quickly loaded with what I was carrying. The whole time, I could feel the men's eyes on me, ready to act if I tried anything. The silence was only interrupted by the sounds of the forest and the noise of the men unloading my cargo. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, thinking of my family, of how this could end. What if they decided I was a risk? But fortunately, after they finished loading the other truck, the leader looked at me again, his eyes still cold, but now with a slight touch of satisfaction. "Now get out of here. And don't look back," he ordered, with a firmness that made me understand it wasn't just a figure of speech. With my heart pounding, I got back into the truck, started the engine, and began driving. The feeling of relief as I left that clearing was overshadowed by the constant fear that they might change their minds and decide to follow me. I kept driving, forcing my eyes not to glance at the rearview mirror, as if any movement could trigger a tragedy. It was only when I saw the lights of the next town and noticed the presence of police at the entrance that I began to breathe more easily. I pulled over and got out, my legs still trembling. I explained what had happened, but the feeling of vulnerability, of having had my life on the line, wouldn't go away. That night changed the way I see my job and the road. Now, every stop, every person I see in the distance, reminds me that danger can be anywhere, hidden behind a false sense of security. I never forgot that trip, and every time I pass through a remote area, the fear of reliving that moment comes back, like a shadow that never leaves me. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss the next video. Check out the 10 terrifying true scary stories by clicking the card on the screen or by finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.